Lieutenant Shigefumi Nagaoka of the Imperial Japanese Navy's 553rd Air Group released two 500-kilogram bombs at USS Franklin on the 19th of March 1945. One bomb struck forward and penetrated the flight deck. The other exploded amidships on the hangar deck area. The ship was carrying fueled aircraft, bombs, rockets, and torpedoes for combat operations off Japan, and the explosions turned that load into a chain of fire. U.S. damage reports describe immediate blast damage, ruptured fittings, shattered communications, and fires starting among aircraft parked below. Men in the hangar and gallery decks were hit by blast and fragments, and wounded sailors began moving into passageways as smoke thickened. The carrier's design gave the bombs more to work with. Franklin was an Essex-class carrier with a long hangar, open aircraft staging areas, and large quantities of aviation gasoline and ordnance ready for launch operations. A bomb that entered the flight deck did not stop at steel plate. It drove downward through structure, started fires in the hangar deck spaces, and spread damage through ready aircraft and fuel lines. The forward explosion and the amidships hit created separate fire sources, which made isolation difficult. Crews reported loss of telephone communications in damaged zones, and damage control parties had to move through smoke and heat with hoses and portable gear. From the Japanese side, the attack looked like a success. Nagaoka's bombs struck a carrier that was already in the middle of a combat loadout, and observers believed they had hit a valuable target. Japanese after-action accounts identified the target as a carrier and treated it as a kill or near kill. The American crew knew something different almost at once. Smoke rose from below the flight deck, fire spread among aircraft and stores, and the ship remained alive long enough for the crew to keep trying to fight it. By the end of the first burst of damage, Franklin was no longer a normal flight deck carrier under attack. It had become a burning mass of fuel, ordnance, and trapped men. The reason those two hits mattered so much was technical, not mysterious. An Essex-class carrier such as Franklin displaced about 27,100 tons standard and carried a large air group with its own fuel, bombs, and rockets. Its hangar deck was not an armored citadel like a battleship's magazines. It was a working space built for speed of launch and recovery. When a 500-kilogram bomb detonated on or near that level, it could rupture fuel lines, damage fire mains, and set off parked aircraft in sequence. Each aircraft on deck or in the hangar represented fuel, hydraulic fluid, ammunition, and magnesium parts that burned intensely once ignited. Franklin was also operating close to the enemy coast on a strike mission, so the ship had aircraft spotted and fueled for immediate launch. That made the damage worse. Naval records and survivor accounts show that fires spread faster than the crew could isolate them, because the ship's internal communications and power were hit early. Once telephone circuits failed in damaged sections, damage control teams had to rely on runners, messengers, and whatever hose lines still had pressure. When ventilation, electrical power, and fire control systems were disrupted together, the ship lost the ability to compartmentalize the disaster quickly. Japanese airmen believed carrier hits should sink or silence a ship quickly. On this occasion they were facing an armored flight deck carrier of the United States Navy's Fast Carrier Force, designed with subdivision, pumps, and a trained damage control organization. The attack plan was therefore sound in one sense: hit the loaded carrier before it could respond. What the attackers did not see was the sheer concentration of ordnance and gasoline already exposed on board. The bombs did not have to destroy the hull. They had to ignite the ship's working load, and they did exactly that. In the first hours after the hits, Franklin was still afloat but badly crippled. Smoke poured through the ship, communications broke down in key spaces, and firefighting parties had to work while wounded men crowded passageways. Official reports record that power failure and damage to internal systems complicated every order. The ship's crew, including repair parties and medical stations, kept trying to move casualties out of the hottest zones and get hoses back into action. Some compartments became so dangerous that sailors were forced to abandon them until access could be reopened. The Japanese side first read the attack as a completed success. The pilots returned with the impression that they had struck a carrier and left it burning hard. Later, Japanese records and post-war summaries recognized that Franklin had not been sunk. That recognition mattered because it meant the attack had not removed a U.S. fast carrier from the war. Instead, the Americans still had a damaged carrier that could be fought for and, eventually, saved. The documented toll was severe. Franklin suffered 724 killed and 265 wounded in the attack and its immediate aftermath. Those numbers reflect the violence of the fires, the explosions that followed, and the difficulty of reaching men trapped below. Yet the ship remained afloat long enough for rescue and salvage efforts to begin, and that alone changed the tactical picture. The enemy had not destroyed the carrier outright, and the U.S. Navy now had to decide how to keep it from dying by fire, flooding, or a final blow at sea. On the darkened decks and in the jammed passageways, that question had already become the next fight. Damage control crews had to work with the ship's own injuries. Franklin had lost much of her electrical power and much of her internal communications, so surviving sailors carried messages by hand and pushed through smoke to reach the sections still reporting fire. Official damage reports describe water being sent into selected spaces to stop the spread, even as other compartments stayed sealed to keep the ship from taking on too much flooding at once. That balancing act mattered. Flooding could save one deck and doom another if it was not controlled. The crew also fought for access. Passageways had to be opened again and again because heat-buckled fittings and debris blocked routes to the hangar and below decks. Men used axes, crowbars, and whatever tools they could find to clear a path to trapped shipmates. In the dark spaces under the flight deck, the work was not only against flame but against collapsing smoke and heat that made breathing nearly impossible. Men moving casualties out of the worst sections sometimes had to pass them hand to hand through narrow corridors. Fire mains and hoses that still held pressure became precious. When one line failed, another had to be dragged into place. Portable pumps were brought into service wherever the ship's own systems could still feed them. The carrier's trained damage control organization was important here, because the work was not improvised by a single crew. Repair parties, medical stations, engineering sailors, and topside crews all had separate tasks, and those tasks had to be kept moving while the ship shuddered and burned. Some sailors stayed at their stations until ordered out. Others worked in blackened clothing after hours in the smoke, carrying stretchers, dragging hose, or passing wounded men to the next team. The record shows a ship that was still alive only because people kept making small decisions under pressure. Isolate this space, flood that one, open this route, save that compartment, send another team forward. That hour-by-hour struggle decided whether Franklin would settle and break apart or remain afloat long enough for outside help. What did the officers and sailors on board have to do next, hour after hour, to keep the ship alive? Franklin's survival mattered because it demonstrated what the fast carrier program had been built to do. An Essex-class carrier was a mass-produced weapon of air power, but it was also a machine for absorbing punishment and staying in the war. The ship's structural subdivision, pumping capacity, firefighting crews, and extensive damage control training gave the Navy a chance to fight a catastrophe instead of simply counting a loss. That was a practical lesson, not a theoretical one. Earlier in the Pacific War, a carrier hit in the wrong place often meant a quick end. Franklin was different because the hull stayed intact long enough for recovery efforts to work. The attack also exposed the limits of Japanese expectations. Nagaoka's bombs struck what looked, from the air, like a mission kill. Japanese aviators and planners had seen American carriers burn before, and they expected a carrier with internal fires and secondary explosions to be finished. Instead, Franklin remained afloat after the initial hits and continued to draw effort from nearby ships. That changed the tactical reading of the attack. The target had not vanished. It had become a damaged but recoverable warship. The larger war lesson was about industrial design and training working together. The United States had built carriers that could be produced in numbers and kept in service after damage that would have ended earlier ships. Franklin's case showed that the Navy's emphasis on damage control was not decorative. It was a fighting system. The ship's survival did not mean the attack failed to hurt. It meant the American fleet had learned to turn survival into combat value, and to do it under fire. Post-war Japanese studies and operational reflections accepted that American fast carriers were much harder to knock out than expected. That recognition fed the broader fear that one strike would not clear the sea. A carrier could burn, lose men, and still refuse to disappear. One carrier refused to go down. The record of Franklin turned that statement from a slogan into a strategic problem for Japan, because a ship that should have been dead was still available for repair, towing, and eventual return. What the enemy believed was destroyed had only been delayed, and that pushed the focus from steel and fire to the people forced to hold the line aboard it. Captain Leslie E. Gares, commanding officer of USS Franklin, remained tied to the disaster long after the flames were out. He was the ship's senior officer during the attack and had to deal with the collapse of normal shipboard command while the crew fought for survival. His post-war record became controversial, and he was later the subject of a court-martial tied to events after the attack. The carrier's immediate survival, however, depended on the officers and petty officers who kept sections organized when the ship's systems failed. Rear Admiral Ralph E. Davison came aboard from outside to help stabilize the situation, and destroyer USS Miller played a central role in assisting the damaged carrier. Other escort ships also came close enough to help with control and rescue work, but Miller's name appears in the documented rescue effort as part of the outside response that made later salvage possible. These were not ceremonial arrivals. They were ships coming alongside a carrier that still had fire, wounded men, and unstable flooding. Survivor accounts describe men with burned clothing and blackened faces working under orders to keep moving. Wounded sailors were carried on stretchers through compartments that still filled with smoke. Some men refused to leave their stations until they were physically relieved. Others helped load casualties even when they were exhausted themselves. Those details show how the ship was held together by ordinary habits under extreme pressure. Passing a stretcher, opening a hatch, hauling a hose, or staying at a post a few minutes longer. The human cost was fixed in the casualty list: 724 dead and 265 wounded. That total included men killed by blast, fire, and later explosions inside the ship. For the survivors, the event became a memory of heat, confusion, and the sound of ships nearby answering distress calls. For the enemy airmen, it became proof that a carrier could be hit hard enough to seem finished without actually sinking. The story then moved from survival on the deck plates to the long process of salvage, repair, and return that would decide what Franklin meant in the war's final months. Franklin was still burning when the next decisions had to be made. Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitscher's Task Force 58 could not leave a blazing carrier adrift near Japan, so nearby ships closed in under danger and began rescue and control work. Destroyer USS Miller, DD 535, came alongside to help recover men from the stricken ship. Other destroyers and small craft later assisted in removing survivors and casualties. The immediate task was not battle but keeping the hull from settling and the fires from reaching the magazines. That meant shoring up flooded spaces, pumping out water where possible, and trying to isolate the worst damage. The ship's own engineering spaces were a second front. Damage reports show that Franklin's machinery still had to be coaxed into life while parts of the ship remained wrecked. Temporary repairs allowed limited power, steering help, and pumping as the crew and rescuers fought to stabilize her. The carrier was taken in tow and, after the battle area, sent first to Pearl Harbor for emergency repair work. Pearl Harbor could not restore her to combat condition, but it could keep her from being lost. The decision to save Franklin took time and manpower in the middle of the Pacific War. The Navy chose salvage over abandonment because the hull had survived and because one more fast carrier still mattered. After Pearl Harbor, Franklin was towed across the Pacific and then through the Panama Canal to the New York Navy Yard, arriving in 1945 for major repairs and modernization. That trip was itself a measure of the ship's survival. A vessel that had looked finished off Japan was still sailing months later, under tow, back to an American yard. For the crew, the aftermath brought a long accounting. The dead were buried or later identified, the wounded were treated, and the survivors were dispersed from the ship. Captain Leslie E. Gares remained in command during the rescue and repair period, but his wartime reputation was badly damaged by the disaster and by later disputes over responsibility. The ship herself was saved, but her combat career at sea was effectively over. The question now was not whether Franklin had burned. It was how a carrier could be reduced to a wreck, carried back across the ocean, and still be kept in the war at all. Franklin is treated as a turning point because it proved something the Pacific War had only partly tested before. A fast carrier could absorb catastrophic internal damage and still survive long enough to return. That mattered operationally. The U.S. Navy had built the Essex-class for speed, air power, and damage control, and Franklin showed that those qualities were not separate. They worked together under fire. The ship's subdivision, pumps, firefighting gear, and trained repair parties gave the fleet a margin that had not existed in earlier carrier losses. The contrast with the opening assumption was stark. Japanese aviators believed that a loaded carrier hit by 2 bombs and followed by internal fires should be lost. Instead, Franklin stayed afloat, and the Navy spent the rest of the war proving that the ship could be recovered. Samuel Eliot Morison, in his official history of the war at sea, treated Franklin as one of the most grievous carrier disasters of the Pacific fighting and as evidence of both the vulnerability and resilience of the fast carrier force. That dual lesson is why the event sits in the record. It was a near destruction that still ended in recovery. The enemy side learned from the same event. Post-war Japanese reflections on carrier warfare accepted that American carriers were harder to kill than expected. Pilots and planners who had seen Franklin burning came away with a harder judgment. A carrier could be hit, scorched, and still not disappear. That did not make the attack a failure in human terms, because the death toll was enormous. But in strategic terms, the strike did not remove the ship from the war on the Japanese timetable. The practical result was a shift in how both sides understood carrier warfare in 1945. To Americans, Franklin confirmed that damage control was combat power. To the Japanese, it confirmed that even a successful strike might not yield the destruction they wanted. From strategy, the story now moves to the people who carried Franklin's memory after the war and into the places where that memory is still kept. Captain Leslie E. Gares survived the war and later became the subject of a Navy court-martial in 1945. He died in 1962. Rear Admiral Ralph E. Davison, who came aboard during the crisis and helped oversee the salvage effort, survived the war and died in 1970. Their names remain tied to the ship's hard aftermath as much as to the attack itself. The ship's final wartime fate was practical rather than dramatic. After the New York Navy Yard repairs, Franklin did not return to combat. She was reclassified as an attack transport, CVA-13 in 1952 and then CVS-13 in 1953, and remained in reserve until she was struck from the Navy list in 1964 and sold for scrap the next year. The great carrier was preserved in memory, not in steel. That memory has several homes. The National Museum of the United States Navy keeps Franklin's story in its carrier and aviation displays, and survivor reunions and publications kept the crew's account in circulation for decades after the war. The ship is also remembered through official Navy histories and damage control studies that used her as a case study in survival. Her story survives in preserved wartime photographs, in the combat record, and in the oral histories of men who came off the ship burned, exhausted, and alive. There is a small but telling detail in the record of the rescue. Sailors moved casualties by stretcher handoff through smoke-filled passageways while others kept hose lines going. That kind of plain, repeated action is how the ship stayed afloat long enough for towing and repair. It is also why Franklin remains one of the best-known examples of damage control in naval history. The opening line was true, but incomplete. The USS Franklin took 2 Japanese bombs and still did not sink. It burned, lost 724 men, and came home under tow because the hull held. Flooding was controlled enough to keep her afloat, and the crew and escort ships kept fighting when the ship looked finished. One carrier refused to go down, and the record shows how. If stories like this matter to you, the next one goes even deeper.